In the final months of World War II, Japan was a nation standing on the edge of devastation, but still unbroken in spirit. The land that had once dreamed of a vast empire stretching across Asia was now shrinking under the relentless weight of American air power. Tokyo, the beating heart of that empire, had become a city of shadows. Its streets were filled with quiet desperation, mothers clutching their children, old men looking to the sky every night, and young boys too small to fight but old enough to understand fear. The war that had begun with ambition and pride had turned into a nightmare that would soon reach its fiery climax. And that climax was about to descend upon Tokyo with a brutality the world had never seen before. By early 1945, the American strategy had shifted from precision bombing to a new kind of destruction, one designed not just to cripple Japan's military power, but to break the will of its people. General Curtis LeMay, the architect of this horrific plan, believed that only through sheer terror could Japan be forced to surrender. He knew that the old wooden cities of Japan were tinderboxes waiting to burn. Tokyo, in particular, was a city built from paper, bamboo, and dreams, and it would take only a spark to turn those dreams into ash. As American B-29 bombers lined up on the runways of the Mariana Islands, each carrying tons of napalm and incendiary bombs, the fate of Tokyo was sealed. The city's defenders could do little but watch the distant sky, praying that somehow, the coming storm would pass them by. Inside Tokyo, life continued in fragile rhythms. The government still spoke of victory, but the people knew better. Every air raid siren brought panic. Every distant drone of engines sent mothers running for cover. The once bustling markets were silent, food was scarce, and morale was collapsing. Schools taught children patriotic songs while hiding the grim truth that Japan was losing the war. The Imperial Army was stretched thin, and American forces were advancing across the Pacific with unstoppable force. Yet, even in despair, there was stubborn pride, a belief that Japan would endure whatever came. For centuries, the Japanese had believed in endurance, in the beauty of sacrifice, in the idea that honor was worth more than life itself. That ancient spirit was about to be tested in ways no one could imagine. March 9, 1945, it began as a cold and windy evening in Tokyo. Most people thought it would be another night of anxiety, another round of sirens and perhaps a few bombs that would miss their mark. But at American bases thousands of miles away, something massive was in motion. Nearly 300 B-29 Superfortress bombers took off under the cover of night. Their engines roared like thunder across the Pacific, carrying death in their bellies, a new kind of firebomb made with a jellied gasoline called napalm. This was not a bomb meant for factories or airfields. This was a weapon designed to burn entire cities to the ground. The pilots had been told that this mission would be decisive. Some believed it would shorten the war. Others just wanted to survive. None could imagine the horror that awaited the people below. As the bombers approached Japan, they dropped to low altitudes, flying without formation lights to avoid detection. Radar operators in Tokyo spotted them, but it was already too late. The first sirens wailed across the city at around midnight. Families scrambled to grab their few belongings, children cried, and people ran toward the designated shelters, but many knew those shelters were useless against fire. The winds were strong that night, a deadly advantage for what was to come. At exactly 12:08 a.m., the first bombs began to fall. They burst open in midair, scattering hundreds of small incendiary canisters that rained down across Tokyo like fiery snow. Within minutes, entire neighborhoods were ablaze. The air turned orange, and the smell of burning wood, oil, and flesh began to merge into one suffocating stench. Firefighters rushed into the inferno, but the flames moved faster than any human could. The incendiaries ignited roofs, walls, and streets, creating what survivors later called a fire tornado. Winds of over 100 miles per hour whipped through the city, feeding the flames and spreading them across miles. People tried to flee to the rivers, thinking the water would save them, but even there, death found them. The heat was so intense that it boiled the water in the canals. Thousands who jumped in to escape the flames were either scalded alive or suffocated by smoke. Mothers tried to shield their children with their own bodies. Old men collapsed in the streets. Dogs, horses, and even birds vanished into the firestorm. Tokyo, one of the largest cities in the world, was being erased in a single night. Above the chaos, American pilots looked down in shock. Even from 5,000 feet up, they could feel the heat. Some vomited at the sight of entire districts glowing like molten metal. One pilot later wrote that it felt like flying over the mouth of hell. But the bombers continued their deadly runs, wave after wave, dropping more incendiaries until the city became one massive sea of fire. In just a few hours, more than 16 square miles of Tokyo were burning uncontrollably. Nearly 100,000 people would die before morning, more than the number killed by the atomic bomb in Nagasaki months later. Most of them were civilians, women, children, the elderly. They were not soldiers, they were not enemies, they were simply caught in the fire of war's cruelty. Back on the ground, the survivors faced scenes beyond imagination. Streets that had once been alive with laughter and commerce were now rivers of ash. The air was thick with soot, and the sky glowed red long after sunrise. People wandered aimlessly, dazed, their faces blackened, their clothes in tatters. Some searched for family members who would never be found. Others sat silently among the ruins, staring into the flames as if trying to wake from a nightmare. The once great capital of Japan had been turned into a wasteland in a single night. Yet the bombs had not stopped, the raids continued night after night, city after city, until Japan itself seemed to vanish under a shroud of smoke. The attack on Tokyo was not just another battle, it was a turning point in human history. It redefined what war could mean, showing that victory could come not only from defeating armies but from breaking the souls of nations. The destruction was so total, so merciless, that even some American leaders questioned the morality of what they had done. But in the eyes of military strategists, it was necessary. The Japanese government still refused to surrender. Every city destroyed, every life lost, was seen as a step closer to ending the war. To them, the firebombing of Tokyo was not a tragedy, it was a message. A message written in flame, surrender, or burn. And yet, through all that devastation, Japan did not immediately yield. Emperor Hirohito remained silent, and the government continued to prepare for a final stand. In underground shelters and shattered offices, generals spoke of honor and defiance. They refused to believe that their empire was dying. For them, the destruction of Tokyo was a wound that would only strengthen their resolve. But for the people, it was the end of everything they had ever known. They had no more strength, no more hope, only ashes. The great city that had once stood as the symbol of Japanese pride was gone, replaced by silence and sorrow. The world would later remember the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the moments that ended the war. But it was the firebombing of Tokyo that truly revealed the full horror of modern warfare. It was the night when technology met terror, when human invention became the instrument of annihilation. The flames of Tokyo did not just destroy buildings, they burned through the conscience of mankind. Even now, decades later, the survivors who lived through that night can still smell the smoke, still hear the screams, still see the red sky that refused to fade. The attack on Tokyo was not just an act of war. It was a lesson, a brutal reminder that in the pursuit of victory, humanity can lose its soul. The night of March 9, 1945, would be remembered by history as the night Tokyo turned into hell. When the first incendiaries burst open over the city, no one could have imagined the scale of destruction that was about to unfold. The people of Tokyo were used to air raids by then, small bombings, brief alarms, moments of panic followed by an eerie calm. But this was different. Within minutes, the sky itself seemed to explode. Thousands of firebombs rained down like burning stars, and the city that had been asleep moments earlier was engulfed in chaos. Entire blocks vanished in an instant. Flames leapt from one wooden house to another, devouring everything in their path. The wind screamed through narrow streets, turning sparks into infernos. In every direction, Tokyo was burning. For the people trapped inside that inferno, there was no plan, no order, only instinct and terror. Families clutched one another, running through smoke-choked alleys that seemed to close in on them. Mothers screamed for their children. Fathers tried to fight the flames with buckets of water, but the fires were beyond human control. The heat was unbearable, even from hundreds of feet away, people's skin blistered. The air was thick and impossible to breathe. One survivor later described it as trying to breathe inside an oven. The sound was overwhelming: explosions, collapsing buildings, people crying, the roar of wind and fire combining into a single monstrous voice that drowned out everything else. The night was alive with destruction, and death was everywhere. As the fire spread, those who could no longer flee began to seek refuge in rivers and canals. Thousands rushed toward the Sumida River, believing water would protect them. But the rivers had become traps. The fire was so intense that it created its own weather, a firestorm, a whirlwind of flames and superheated air. The winds grew to hurricane strength, sucking people off their feet and into the blaze. Those who reached the river found it already packed with bodies, men, women, and children clinging to each other, screaming as bombs exploded above them. The heat was so fierce that the surface of the water began to boil. People jumped in, only to be cooked alive. Others tried to hide under bridges, but the steel beams glowed red and collapsed under the heat. It was a night when even the safest places became instruments of death. In the heart of the city, entire districts disappeared within minutes. Asakusa, Shitamachi, and Honjo, areas filled with wooden homes, shops, and shrines, were reduced to ashes. The famous temples that had stood for centuries were gone. The smell of burning flesh hung in the air like poison. Survivors stumbled through the ruins, some with their clothes on fire, others carrying the charred bodies of loved ones. There were no hospitals left to run to, no doctors to help. Everything was burning. The once beautiful city, filled with history and culture, was now a living nightmare. The only light came from the fires themselves, a red, flickering glow that illuminated the faces of the dying and the dead. High above, the American pilots watched the destruction from their bombers. Some were proud, others horrified. Many had no idea what kind of devastation their bombs would cause. They had been told the targets were industrial zones, but as the flames spread, it became clear that the entire city was being consumed. "We could see the flames 150 miles away," one pilot recalled. It was like watching a sunrise made of fire. For hours, the bombers circled back, dropping more and more incendiaries until their bays were empty. When they finally turned for home, Tokyo was still burning, a sea of fire stretching as far as the eye could see. The pilots' radio chatter was filled with disbelief. No one had ever witnessed such destruction. They didn't realize that, in a single night, more civilians had died than in any bombing in history. Back on the ground, the survivors faced impossible choices. Some tried to save neighbors trapped in collapsed homes. Others ran blindly, searching for air that wasn't filled with smoke. One mother, burned and bleeding, was found clutching her infant's lifeless body. Another woman wandered the ruins calling her husband's name until her voice gave out. The fire spared no one, the poor, the rich, the young, the old. Even the hospitals that remained standing were filled beyond capacity, and many of them burned down later as the fires spread. Doctors worked by candlelight, cutting burned flesh with trembling hands, trying to save those who had no chance. The streets were covered with bodies. The smell was unbearable. The heat lingered for days. By morning, the fires still hadn't stopped. Smoke covered the entire city. The rising sun was hidden behind a thick black cloud that stretched for miles. The survivors crawled from the ruins like ghosts. They were covered in soot and blood, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. Everywhere they looked, there was nothing, no homes, no families, no hope. Only ashes. The great capital of Japan, once the pride of an empire, had become an open grave. In the days that followed, rescue workers, mostly soldiers and volunteers, moved through the rubble, searching for survivors. What they found instead were bodies piled in the streets, floating in the rivers, buried under collapsed houses. Tens of thousands had vanished without a trace, their remains reduced to dust. The official death toll was around 100,000, but many historians believe it was far higher, perhaps 120,000 or more. The psychological impact of that night was as devastating as the physical destruction. People who had survived lost their minds. Some sat in silence for days, unable to speak. Others screamed uncontrollably. The shock was too great to comprehend. Children searched for parents who would never come back. Entire families had been wiped out in seconds. Temples and schools became makeshift morgues where bodies were lined up, burned beyond recognition. The smell of death lingered in Tokyo for weeks. And yet, even as the city mourned, American bombers returned again and again. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all met the same fate. The firebombing campaign would eventually destroy more than 60 Japanese cities. But it was Tokyo that remained the symbol of absolute destruction, the night when war reached its cruelest point. As the embers cooled, Japan faced a new reality. Its government was still preaching resistance, still dreaming of a miraculous victory, but the truth was undeniable: the nation was broken. Tokyo was the center of politics, industry, and culture, and now it was gone. Thousands of families were homeless, living in makeshift shelters or wandering the countryside. The emperor's palace had barely escaped the flames, but the city around it was unrecognizable. The imperial leadership continued to broadcast messages of hope, but no one believed them anymore. For the first time, the people began to doubt everything: their leaders, their destiny, even their gods. The fire had not just destroyed buildings, it had burned away the illusion of invincibility. Yet, amid the ruins, there were stories of impossible survival. One man survived by hiding inside a water tank. A young nurse carried 20 children to safety through burning streets. A mother found her daughter alive under the wreckage 3 days later. These moments of humanity stood like faint lights in the darkness, reminders that even in the face of unimaginable horror, people still clung to life. They became the living witnesses of Tokyo's destruction, carrying their memories through generations. To this day, their testimonies reveal the truth that statistics can never capture: the agony, the fear, the heartbreak of that night. The world would later look back and call it strategic bombing. Historians would debate whether it was necessary. Military planners would justify it as a way to end the war quickly. But for those who lived through it, there was nothing strategic about the horror. The attack on Tokyo was pure destruction, the deliberate burning of a city and its people. The flames that night were not just weapons of war, they were symbols of what humanity was capable of when it lost all restraint. The moral lines blurred. Civilization itself seemed to vanish in the smoke. By the time the fires finally died out, Tokyo was a different world. The streets were gone, replaced by endless fields of gray. Where neighborhoods had once stood, there were only piles of charred timber and twisted metal. People built small huts from scraps of burned wood. Children played among the ruins because they had nowhere else to go. Life began again, slowly and painfully, rising from the ashes. But the scars would never heal. Those who had seen the flames could never forget them. The night of March 9, 1945. When the fire finally died and the sun rose over Tokyo on March 10, 1945, what remained was not a city, it was a graveyard stretching beyond sight. The once proud capital of the Japanese Empire had vanished, replaced by an endless wasteland of gray. Smoke still drifted from the ruins. The air was heavy with the smell of burnt wood, melted metal, and human remains. Nothing moved except the wind. Those who survived wandered through the destruction like lost souls, searching for homes that no longer existed, calling the names of family members who would never answer. The streets had disappeared beneath piles of rubble. Landmarks, temples, and schools, everything that defined Tokyo, were gone. The imperial palace still stood, miraculously untouched, like a cruel symbol of power surrounded by the bones of its people. In the first hours after the bombing, chaos ruled. Rescue teams were non-existent. The government had no plan for a disaster of such magnitude. Firefighters and soldiers were overwhelmed, their equipment destroyed, their bodies exhausted. Survivors tried to help each other, digging through the ashes with bare hands. Mothers wept as they pulled small, lifeless forms from beneath collapsed walls. The rivers that once gave life to the city were now filled with blackened bodies. The water, once clear, had turned thick and dark, clogged with debris and ash. People were afraid to drink it, afraid even to touch it. In the parks and open spaces, thousands of corpses were piled in makeshift funeral pyres. The flames that had destroyed the city were now being used to cremate its dead. For days, the fires continued to smolder. Smoke covered the sky, blotting out the sun. The smell of burning flesh lingered in every corner. Birds stopped singing. Silence became the soundtrack of Tokyo's ruin. The few hospitals that survived the raid were overflowing with the injured, men and women covered in burns, their skin blackened, their eyes swollen shut. Doctors worked without rest, using scraps of cloth for bandages, rainwater for cleaning wounds. There was no medicine, no anesthesia, no comfort. Many of the wounded begged to be allowed to die. Children cried for parents who were gone. Nurses and volunteers moved through the chaos in tears, unable to help everyone. They saw suffering beyond imagination, and it broke them. In the days that followed, Japan's military government did everything it could to suppress the full truth of what had happened. Newspapers were censored, radio broadcasts spoke only of minor damage. The regime feared that if people knew the true scale of destruction, morale would collapse completely. But rumors spread quickly. Survivors told their stories, travelers brought news of the burning city, and soon the entire nation knew that Tokyo was gone. The illusion of invincibility, the idea that Japan could endure anything, had been shattered. Yet the government refused to surrender. They told people to rebuild, to stay strong, to fight on. But how could anyone fight when their homes were ash and their families were gone? The survivors faced hunger, disease, and despair. With the city's infrastructure destroyed, food and clean water were almost impossible to find. People scavenged through the ruins for anything edible, rice, beans, even burned vegetables. The smell of decay was constant. Flies and rats infested the ruins. Thousands more died in the weeks after the bombing from starvation and infection. Bodies that had been buried began to rot under the heat, releasing a sickening stench. Yet, even in this horror, life continued. People built small huts from the wreckage, pieces of metal, broken doors, anything they could find. They called these shelters barracks, though they were nothing more than piles of debris held together by hope. For many survivors, the psychological scars were worse than the physical ones. They had seen things no human should ever see, entire families burned alive, children crying in the streets, rivers full of corpses. Some lost their sanity. Others lost their will to live. The trauma became a silent epidemic. There were no psychologists, no counselors, only the endless emptiness of survival. Children grew up among ruins, learning about death before they ever learned about life. Women who had lost everything wandered the streets, holding photographs of husbands or sons who would never return. And yet, through all of this suffering, there was also resilience. A quiet, stubborn determination began to rise from the ashes. Within weeks, small groups of citizens began to organize. They cleared roads, rebuilt wells, planted makeshift gardens in the ruins. The spirit of community, something deep within Japanese culture, refused to die. Even in despair, people found ways to help each other. Old men shared their last bits of food with orphans. Neighbors rebuilt burned temples as shelters for the homeless. Priests held mass funerals, chanting prayers over fields of ashes. The smell of incense mixed with the scent of smoke. These acts of humanity gave the survivors strength. It was a reminder that even after total destruction, compassion still existed. But the deeper question remained, why had it come to this? Many Japanese began to question their leaders for the first time. The government had promised victory. They had promised glory. Instead, the people were living in ruins. Secretly, some began to whisper that perhaps the Americans were not monsters, but that Japan's own leaders had led them into this disaster. Such thoughts were dangerous, expressing them openly could lead to imprisonment or worse. Yet the idea spread quietly, like an ember that refused to die. The bombing had not only destroyed Tokyo's buildings, it had destroyed faith in the empire itself. Across the Pacific, the American military celebrated the mission as a success. Newspapers in the United States praised the attack as a major blow to Japan's war effort. Few understood what had truly happened on the ground. The words, firebombing, could not capture the reality, the screams, the smell, the unimaginable suffering. For General LeMay, it was proof that his strategy worked. He would later say, "If we lose the war, we'll be tried as war criminals." But he believed he had done what was necessary to end the conflict. To him, every life lost in Tokyo was a step closer to peace. To the survivors, it was madness. As weeks turned into months, Japan continued to burn. The bombing raids did not stop with Tokyo. The Americans moved systematically across the nation, destroying one city after another, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, Yokohama. By the time it was over, more than 60 cities lay in ruins. The Japanese military could no longer defend its skies. Anti-aircraft guns were useless, fuel and planes were gone. Every night, the people waited for the sound of bombers, and every morning they woke to new ruins. It was not just a war of soldiers anymore, it was a war against civilians, a war against the spirit of a nation. And yet, the government still refused to surrender. By July 1945, Japan was a dying nation. Its industries were gone, its cities burned, its people starving. The firebombing of Tokyo had been the beginning of the end. It broke the country's back. The Japanese leadership knew it, but pride would not let them admit defeat. They spoke of fighting to the last man, of one final glorious battle on home soil. But the people no longer had the strength to believe. They had seen the true face of war, and they wanted only for it to end. The once fanatical loyalty to the emperor began to fade into exhaustion. Every burned city became a question, how much more must be sacrificed before it is enough? Even as the bombing continued, Japan's artists, writers, and philosophers began to reflect on the meaning of their suffering. Many saw it as punishment, not from the Americans, but from fate itself. Some believed the nation had lost its way, that its quest for power had brought divine retribution. Others saw it as the inevitable cost of war in a modern world, where machines had replaced morality. But for the ordinary people of Tokyo, there was no philosophy, no explanation that could make sense of what they had lived through. They only knew loss. Every family had a story, a missing father, a burned child, a vanished home. The city had become a cemetery of memories. And yet, within that destruction, something remarkable began to happen. Out of despair came unity. Out of ashes came determination. The people of Tokyo began to rebuild, not for the empire, but for themselves. They gathered bricks, wood, and metal from the ruins. Children carried buckets of water. Women cooked for construction crews. Men built small shops along the streets. Slowly, painfully, life returned. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was life. Tokyo, the city that had been erased, began to breathe again. The people who had seen the worst that humanity could offer now became the foundation for a new Japan, one that would eventually rise from its own ashes to become stronger than ever before. But in 1945, that future was still a distant dream. The scars were too fresh, the losses too deep. As survivors looked upon the blackened skyline, they wondered if they could ever forgive, or even understand, what had been done to them. The firebombing had changed everything. It had turned war into annihilation, victory into horror. The people of Tokyo had witnessed the moment when civilization burned itself alive. And though the flames had gone out, their light still flickered in memory, a reminder of how fragile humanity truly is. As 1945 moved into its final months, Japan stood on the edge of collapse. The firebombing of Tokyo had burned more than a city, it had scorched the soul of a nation. The once mighty empire was a shell of its former self, its great cities reduced to ash and its people living in ruins. Every night, more bombers came. Every dawn revealed new graves. By summer, even the most loyal soldiers and citizens began to whisper that the end was near. The war that had promised eternal glory had instead delivered ruin and despair. But the spirit of the Japanese people, though shattered, was not entirely extinguished. Deep within the ruins, a quiet resolve began to form, a belief that if Japan was to survive, it would have to be reborn from its own ashes. In July 1945, the world changed again. The United States issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. The warning was clear: accept peace or face prompt and utter destruction. But Japan's leaders hesitated. They still hoped for better terms, still dreamed of preserving their empire and their emperor's divine status. They didn't yet understand what kind of destruction America now possessed. The firebombing of Tokyo had been unimaginable, but what was coming next would defy even the horrors of that night. In early August, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were obliterated by atomic bombs, killing over 200,000 people in an instant. The earth shook, and the sky turned to light. It was as if the fires of Tokyo had returned in a new, deadlier form, a final, merciless warning that the age of total war had reached its ultimate conclusion. When Emperor Hirohito finally addressed the nation on August 15, 1945, his voice was trembling. It was the first time the Japanese people had ever heard their emperor speak. His words were carefully chosen, poetic yet full of grief. He said that Japan must endure the unendurable and accept defeat. For the people, the announcement was both a relief and a heartbreak. The war was over, but so too was everything they had believed in. The empire that had promised divine victory was gone. The soldiers who had fought for honor returned home to ashes. The families who had prayed for triumph now prayed only for survival. The bombing of Tokyo had been the first signal that this moment would come, the moment when Japan had to face the truth of its own mortality. In the weeks after the surrender, Allied troops arrived in Japan. American soldiers walked through the ruins of Tokyo, seeing firsthand what their bombs had done. Many were stunned into silence. What they saw was not an enemy, but a broken people, children digging through rubble for food, old women sitting beside the burned remains of their homes. The scale of destruction was beyond anything they had imagined. For the survivors, the occupation brought fear and uncertainty. Would they be punished? Humiliated? Instead, something unexpected happened. The Americans came not as conquerors but as rebuilders. They brought food, medicine, and supplies. They began to rebuild schools, hospitals, and roads. For many Japanese, it was confusing: the same hands that had burned their cities were now helping them rise again. The scars, however, were not so easily healed. Physically, Tokyo was gone. Spiritually, Japan was lost. The people struggled to find meaning in their suffering. Some turned to religion, others turned inward, seeking answers in silence. The temples that had survived became places of mourning. The priests chanted prayers for the souls of the dead, whose numbers were so vast that their names could never all be known. Families visited the ashes of their old neighborhoods, lighting incense where their homes once stood. The firebombing had become more than an event, it was now a wound that pulsed in the national memory, a symbol of both tragedy and transformation. The Japanese word for reconstruction, fuko, became the heart of the nation's new purpose. In the years that followed, Japan began one of the most extraordinary recoveries in human history. Out of the ashes, a new Tokyo rose, modern, resilient, and determined. The ruins were cleared, and new buildings appeared where charred rubble had once stood. Streets were widened, bridges rebuilt, trains ran again. Children returned to school. Markets reopened. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the silence of despair. It was as if the nation had decided that the only way to honor the dead was to live well, to create a future so bright that the darkness of the past could never return. The memory of the firebombing was never erased, but it became a source of strength. The people had seen the end of the world, and they had survived it. By the 1950s, Tokyo had become a city of contrast, modern skyscrapers standing beside ancient temples, neon lights glowing over quiet shrines. The spirit of endurance that had carried the Japanese through centuries of hardship once again defined them. They turned their suffering into creativity, discipline, and progress. The factories that had once built weapons now produced cars, radios, and cameras that would soon conquer global markets. The same meticulous craftsmanship that had once gone into swords and ships was now building a new kind of empire, one of technology, culture, and innovation. The ashes of Tokyo had given birth to a new Japan, not of war, but of peace. Yet, no matter how modern the skyline became, the ghosts of 1945 never left. Each year, on the anniversary of the bombing, survivors gathered to remember the night the sky turned red. They spoke softly, their voices trembling with age and pain. Some brought photographs, others only memories. They told stories of the children they lost, the homes they built again, the neighbors who saved them. Younger generations listened in silence, trying to imagine what that night had been like. Many wept. For them, it was more than history, it was identity. The firebombing of Tokyo was not just about destruction, it was about the cost of peace. It was a lesson that every Japanese child grew up hearing, never again. As the decades passed, historians began to debate the morality of the attack. Was it necessary? Was it justified? Could the war have ended without such horror? The answers were never simple. Some argued that the firebombing shortened the war and saved lives in the long run. Others called it one of the greatest war crimes of the 20th century. But the people who had lived through it rarely spoke in terms of blame. For them, the question was not why it happened, but how humanity could let it happen again. They had seen how technology could turn cities into infernos, how ideology could blind nations to compassion. Their memories became warnings, to Japan, to America, to the world. In modern Tokyo, the evidence of that night has almost vanished. The city is alive, vibrant, filled with lights and laughter. But beneath its surface, traces remain. Some streets still follow the paths of the old neighborhoods that burned. In certain parks, small monuments stand quietly, engraved with the names of those who perished. At the Yokoamicho Park Memorial Hall, visitors can see artifacts from that night, melted glass, charred stones, children's toys fused by fire. The display is simple, silent, and devastating. It reminds everyone who enters that behind every skyscraper and neon sign lies a story written in flame. What makes the story of Tokyo's destruction and rebirth so profound is not just the scale of suffering, but the strength that followed. The people who survived did not seek revenge, they sought renewal. They transformed their pain into purpose. In doing so, they showed the world that even the deepest scars can become sources of beauty and resilience. The city that once symbolized human destruction became a symbol of human perseverance. The ashes of 1945 became the foundation of one of the most peaceful and prosperous nations on earth. And yet, the moral shadow of that night remains. The firebombing of Tokyo reminds us of what war truly is, not glory, not strategy, but fire and death. It is a warning about what happens when humanity surrenders its conscience to the pursuit of victory. In every generation, as new technologies of destruction emerge, that warning becomes more urgent. The flames that consumed Tokyo may be gone, but their light still burns as a mirror held up to the world, asking us to look at ourselves and remember what we are capable of, both the horror we can unleash, and the hope we can create after it. In the end, Japan was destroyed in 1945, but it was also reborn. The same nation that once burned became one of peace, innovation, and humility. The same people who once feared the sky now fill it with airplanes carrying travelers, not bombs. Tokyo, once a city of ashes, is now a city of light. Its skyline gleams not in fire but in the reflection of progress. The lesson of 1945 lives on in every building, every family, every moment of peace that Japan now enjoys. It stands as a testament to what humanity can overcome, and a reminder of what must never happen again.